we present. Depending on the volume of questions, we might just stop as we go and answer questions if it kind of aids the conversation. Otherwise, we'll get to it at the end. But so what have you been up to, Robbie, other than the sim racing, obviously, based on the background?
Yeah, not much. A lot of that. Trying to stay fit as much as possible. Just difficult because all the gyms are closed and stuff, but just doing runs and stuff like that. My daily routine has become a little bit boring. Lots of looking at screens, but trying to just stay ready for whenever we can get back in the real car.
When's the last time you were in the car?
I guess it would be I did some coaching at Sebring, but I think last time I drove competitively was at COTA. Yeah, COTA early March for the SRO event with Flying Lizard. But we've got some testing planned coming up, which hopefully goes ahead. It looks pretty good, like it will. So, just looking forward to honestly getting back into the car.
Yeah.
I feel like I haven't driven in years, but it's definitely been a couple of months. The longest time I've been off from driving in probably 3 years or so. So
yeah,
definitely itching to get back at it, as I'm sure everybody is.
Yeah, that's especially tough because you're in a car so consistently between IMSA and SRO, private coaching. So I meant to ask you that the Flying Lizard team switched to Astons this year, right?
Yeah. We ran a Porsche last year, and now in the Aston GT4, which is a really nice car to drive. Very advanced for a GT4 car. They keep getting more and more advanced as they come out. And then, basically my main commitment is that, and then the big IMSA stuff with Turner in GTD and GS. So hopefully that stuff will all continue. Some stuff has been canceled, but mostly it's been rescheduled. So hopefully we just have a very busy end of the year if it's safe to get back to racing again.
Yeah, very condensed schedule.
Yeah, it's going to be a lot of travel and in a very short amount of time. But I'm whatever we can do to just kind of get back to normalcy will be great. But you have to wait and see, I guess.
There'll be something therapeutic about getting back to the track and kind
honestly, just getting back into the swing of things. Like little things you take for granted, I'm sure will be much more enjoyable this time around. Not that I ever take it for granted, but even just being at the track, interacting with people you become so close to over the years is just something that I'm sure everybody's missing right now.
Yeah, I think we all are. So everybody that's already on here, thank you for being prompt and on time and part of the conversation. Let us know in the chat box what you drive, where your home tracks are, what you would consider your home racetrack or the tracks you know the best. If you've driven a bunch of tracks, let us know. We'll be talking about braking from kind of a 30,000 foot view, but we want to apply it to some tracks specifically. We'll look at a little bit of data for some tracks that should be familiar to a lot of people. And then we'll try to apply our conversation in ways that is more applicable to what you're doing as well. So that's why we want to know cars as well, just so that we know if we can speak to somebody driving an open wheel car versus a Corvette. But that we'll get started in about 4 minutes here. The last email notification with the link to join just went out, so we should have a bunch of folks joining us here. And just for the process, any kind of conversation as far as just maybe talking to other people that you see that are involved, or maybe just something that is more trivial, questions that you don't necessarily need to have answered, but maybe you just want to express or whatever, that's for the chat box. If you want Robbie or myself to answer a question live on air, put it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen.
Yeah, we actually just got one. I answered it I typed it in, but David Miller asked if that was an iRacing setup behind. And yeah, it is. It's a sim. I can use all kinds of different sims, but mostly I'm doing iRacing with BMW in this IMSA championship that's going on virtually. So that and some other stuff with BMW and at BS Competition, who I just signed with as a sim team. So lots of sim driving while there's no real driving. It's been
Tell
fun.
us about the sim deal, because you have the vaunted pro racing gig that we all want. You co-drive with Bill Auberland of all people.
Yeah.
But now you're in COVID life, also being a paid sim racer.
Yeah, it's been fun. I've always been fairly into iRacing, but honestly, really just for fun with some friends. I've always basically just done it casually. I've always tried to kind of go for world records in the practice sessions and just stuff like that. Never really did it on a serious, call it esports level. But recently, with all that's going on in the world, obviously it's become a much bigger deal. And I've been involved with BMW on kind of their big push in the M8 and IMSA in that championship. And yeah, I recently signed with a team called BS Competition, who's relatively new to sim racing, with some really, really experienced people based in Germany. And yeah, essentially they run all the big iRacing races that you would think of, like Daytona 24-hour, Sebring 12-hour on iRacing, Bathurst. Recently we did the Nürburgring 24. My teammates actually finished 1-2 in that race. I was in a third car that crashed out, but yeah, and then we had a sim race on Sunday, the BMW Sim 120, which there's a lot of prize money and people behind. So yeah, that's been a lot of fun just joining that team. They're honestly probably some of the guys now are at the top of sim racing and really all the world and in certain categories. Obviously winning the Nürburgring 24, it's so competitive on iRacing, and yeah, the BMW Sim 120 event at the Nürburgring GP track. So it's obviously changing all the time, the different sim platforms. I've mainly focused on iRacing. I have a good relationship with iRacing, and that's been my main kind of source of training in a sense. It's obviously not quite as good in real life in certain ways, but it certainly is a very good substitute while there's no real stuff going on. So yeah, it's been a lot of fun.
I think David said earlier in the chat that he was going to try to put into practice some of the things we talk about on the sim, which is a really great idea.
Totally doable. Yeah.
Yeah.
Every technique applied, obviously. Yeah. You're not necessarily getting all the same sensory inputs that you would in real life, mainly just basic G's and forces that you don't feel. But what you do with the steering wheel and the brake pedal and the throttle is all extremely relevant to the real car, or, whatever kind of different cars you guys are driving. So it's definitely a good training tool. Helps keep me sharp. So I definitely recommend it.
We'll jump right into it with some intros here in just a second. But I think the last thing on sim racing is once you do enough of it, you do enough driving and racing in the real world, and you do enough sim racing, it's pretty easy to understand what parallels and what doesn't.
Yeah.
Right? Like there's certain things in sim racing that you would never do or never apply. Like when I first started iRacing, the trick way to go around Lime Rock in the MX-5 was to basically hold wide open throttle, and like at the uphill, you just squeeze your left foot on the brake, and like as you were turning, and that was kind of like
there's some different stuff. Yeah,
right. You would never do something like that in real life, but once you do it, once you have enough experience translating between the two worlds, it becomes really easy.
I think what's cool is there's a skill set of adaptation and different things that apply. There's tricks in the simulator that work that you can't do in real life, but just the same, and it's vice versa. There's things you do in real life that don't work in the sim. So I think what's cool as a racing driver is to try to manipulate both. You're obviously looking for the edge, and you're looking to have, the best technique in each given discipline, and yeah, there's subtle differences, but I think the actual exercise of maximizing those two different disciplines is really, really productive for your driving as a whole. And driving different cars, you can drive an F1 car, you can drive a Mazda MX-5. So it's a really cool challenge and a really good training tool, I find.
Absolutely. Flexing some muscles that you don't normally get to exercise.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, looks like we have the majority of people are looking for about 26 folks total. So we'll go ahead and get started.
Sweet.
Obviously, most of you probably know me. I'm Andrew with Apex Pro, so welcome. If you have not already, introduce yourself to the rest of the group in the chat and let us know where your home track is, where you're from, what kind of car you drive, so we can apply our conversation as relevantly as possible to you. Hudson Holcomb, I'm sorry, welcome. Good to see you virtually. It's been too long. We live in the same city. Devin, good to see you, Devin. I hope all is well. Mike Clark, the man with the plan, welcome. Mike's got a new Cayman GT4, Robbie, so he's
awesome.
jonesing to get to the track.
Awesome.
Tracy Gadoo, lots of good folks. Todd Pope, thanks for joining us, guys. So this will be a lot of fun. We're going to cover, you'll see actually kind of an outline start to appear behind us. So if you have a piece of paper or a notepad or an iPad or something to take notes on, that'd be great. This is being recorded currently. It will be posted to a private link on YouTube that we'll send to you at the end. Any questions that you have while we go ahead and type those into the Q&A box, and we'll either answer them via text there or live through our discussion kind of as we go. So Robby, who the hell are you?
Yeah, welcome guys. Thanks for joining us. Yeah, I'm Robby Foley. I drive in IMSA with Turner Motorsport in GTD and GS, as well as Flying Lizard Motorsport in SRO GT4. Do a lot of private coaching and different kind of events also. Known Andrew for a long time. We've been good buddies going all the way back to Auburn University. So we've known each other for a while, and I thought this would be a fun exercise to talk about some stuff that we're passionate about and try to share some good info with you guys. So hopefully you'll enjoy it, and we'll try to provide you guys with some insight on kind of, at least from my side, what I do and how I try to maximize braking and what that means to me and how to get the best out of yourselves and your car.
Awesome. So this will be a fun conversation because we've had the benefit of spending a lot of time together, and you coached me when I was doing Probably World Challenge stuff, and your perspective and data and the whole conversation that we had about driving was just eye-opening for me. So I think being able to share that's really, really important here. We're going to first define, and you can see on our whiteboard back here, we're going to define threshold braking. So what is it when we say threshold braking? And Robby's got a great definition of it, because we think of threshold braking as a high speed to low speed situation where we're hammering the brake pedal, we're on the brake pedal for a very long time, slowing the car down. But in fact, we can define it in a lot of different ways. So we're going to talk about really what that means, and we'll transition that into a conversation about the three phases of braking. How do we break those down? And with that, we'll show a little bit of data. Not a lot for those of you that maybe aren't Apex Pro users, or you're not familiar with the app or the software. We won't be going into too much detail there, but we'll just be using it to represent some of the things that we're talking about. So let's talk a little bit about threshold braking, Robby, and I'll let you do the intro. We actually had a couple of folks just purchase the webinar in the last 5 minutes, so I need to send them the information to log in.
Okay, cool. Yeah.
If you want to go ahead and talk about what is threshold braking and maybe how it's different in different cars or in your experience.
Yeah, I think one thing that's important to consider straight off the bat is everything that we do and every input we give to the car is all about what the tire will want to see or what we can manipulate the tire to do. So I think commonly when people think of threshold braking, they think of smashing the brake pedal as hard as physically possible, which in a lot of cases is true. But to me, it's important to consider the differences and also think about you're just trying to maximize the tire's ability to slow down, which is kind of how I define it. And that's a little bit different based on different platforms. For instance, in my early career, I drove a lot of cars on street-based tires, Skip Barber cars that were on a BF Goodrich street tire. And the way you would load that tire was very sensitive. So instead of a massive hit of the brake, you might roll into the brake a little bit more initially, still trying to reach what we call max peak pressure, but it was very easy to overstep that limit of the tire. So when we threshold brake, we're reaching a max peak pressure. The difference is how to get to that peak pressure without overstepping and slipping the tire. So again, as I mentioned just before, in the MX-5 on a street-based tire, or maybe if you guys are driving in a series like WRL or AER with kind of a required tire with maybe a little bit less grip than like an R compound per se, or whatever tire you're on, you basically have, we'll call it 100% grip to use, and we're just trying to do all that in a straight line. That's the threshold. So sometimes it's a little bit better to roll into the brake to not overshock the front tires, and you're basically still achieving that max level of grip in a straight line, but not overstepping it and getting into the ABS too much, or if you don't have ABS, locking the fronts, etc. It's also a little bit variable to how much pitch you have under braking. So if you've got a relatively soft suspension setup with a lot of suspension travel, you can experience a lot of pitch under braking that is a massive transfer of weight to the front, which can also shock the front tire and cause the front tire to slip or lock or or lose its peak max grip. So I guess in short, a threshold is just maximizing 100% of the tire's available grip to brake in a straight line. That's how we define threshold braking. The exact technique is somewhat variable based on your platform and your tire, but the theory behind it is the same. You're getting 100% of braking force out of the tire, which is usually by attacking the brake fairly hard or as hard as possible right away in a straight line. And then maintaining that all the way to the point where you may start to turn the car in. So this is typically a long brake zone, a threshold brake that you may experience into a hairpin or something like that.
Something that the way that you defined it earlier that I wrote down, that if you're watching, you have a notepad in front of you, this is a great thing to write down. You said threshold braking is the maximum brake force the tire will allow.
Yeah.
Which is a great way to define it.
Yeah, just in short. And I think something important to dive into as well is a little bit to do with some certain things that I think you and I both see a lot, and people that we coach and help out is people struggle to find the limit of the threshold. And a very common thing to see is someone brake a little bit early and maybe a little bit light, or they brake at the threshold right away, but because they kind of hit the brakes early, they start to trail the brake in a straight line, and they're not using 100% of the capability of the tire to slow down. So they think they're at the limit of the brakes, but they're actually not. You could, in fact, brake later, harder for longer, and more, we call it efficiently slow the car down in a straight line. So that's a very common thing that we see. And there's different ways to attack that. For me, when I'm going to a new tracker, I'm teaching somebody basically a new track to them. I always say brake hard but early, and brake as hard as possible in a straight line for as long as possible to basically feel what that deceleration feels like. Yeah. A lot of people get stuck in thinking they're at the limit when they're not. But say you can brake at the 2 board. Start by braking at the 3.5 or the 4 board as hard as possible. Realize that you've overslowed the entry, and in a succession of 3 or 4 laps, keep getting later and later and later until you find that peak. It's very easy for someone to become complacent and develop the habit of braking at the 3 when they could brake at the 2, because they're starting that trail to brake early and not maximizing the braking in a straight line. So I think that's really critical, and there's a lot of time in that a lot of people miss. And there's different elements to that. You have certain muscle memory. You're just used to doing something. If you've been doing it over and over and over, you have a lot of repetition, and the way you approach the corner will become different. So it's all about kind of learning and adapting in that sense. But we always want to maximize our ability to brake when we're in a straight line, and that's a threshold.
Yeah, absolutely. And the reason I like that definition of it so much, to kind of go off of everything that you just said there, is because even in corners that don't have a big speed delta, where we're not approaching at a high speed to slow for, to take 100 miles per hour off to make the corner, right? This is not like turn 10 at Road Atlanta or 13 at VIR or any long straightaway where you're going into a slow corner. There are corners that aren't like that, where we're just bleeding off a little bit of speed.
Right.
But the threshold braking terminology still applies if we define it as maximizing the braking force that the tire will allow. That means that every time we brake on the racetrack, we're braking at threshold braking. But the amount of brake pressure that we apply, or the amount that the amount of longitudinal deceleration that the car has, might differ for the corner, for the car, for the conditions.
Yeah.
That to me, that definition works.
Yep. Yeah. And in the trail brake, you're also technically maximizing the brake force the tire will allow. But I think, as we're trying to describe it, when you're braking in a straight line, you can in fact you can over brake in a sense. So you can overload the tire. It's somewhat uncommon in a sense, but you typically find it in a street tire when you get into the ABS hard, and you're over slipping the front tire. You're asking too much of it, and that's what we want to avoid. But in reality, when people struggle with the threshold brake, they're braking too soft with not is hard. A spike is what we're looking for. So I think as you maybe find yourself experimenting with different ways to maximize your braking in real life, you always want to brake as hard as possible. You can always dial it back first, but a lot of people become complacent and comfortable braking a little bit early and a little bit light, and they think they're at the threshold when in reality that's not the case.
So to go off what you said, and you mentioned ABS earlier, Bill Kring, he drives a Cayman and also has a Civic Type R, and his question is it okay to hear tire chirping if ABS is not engaged?
Chirping, yeah, it depends a little bit.
Street-based tire.
Yeah, street-based tire. So we used to have this saying in the MX-5 and Skip Barber years ago that a screaming tire is a happy tire, and that was correct to an extent. Chirping, to me, I typically hear it on the ABS because it's like a pulsation of chirping. The tire is initially locked for like a millisecond, and then it's unlocking, and that's the chirping. So anytime you're hearing chirping, that's kind of at a high frequency, you're slipping the tire. I would say if you're in a street-based tire, like the noise the tire should be making should be fairly constant and not sudden. If you have a sudden chirp and that kind of a movement, you're overslipping the 100% of the tire, the max grip that's allowed. So you're definitely hearing like a squeal or a whine for sure on a street-based tire, but I would say that avoiding chirping is definitely the best way. You could be experiencing that in a downshift. Maybe type in the chat what part of the corner that's in. Is that the rear tires when you let the clutch out? That could be a downshifting issue. It could be a lot of different things, but in general, chirping would be bad because you're suddenly shocking the tire with some force, and you want to be physically loading it the entire time, somewhat in a more linear fashion. If you looked at a friction circle or a G-trace, you would not see a progressive kind of smooth curve in what the friction circle would be doing. It's a very sudden shock of a movement. So in general, I would say chirping is bad. In the general sense.
Yeah, on a street-based tire, if it's an inconsistent noise, it's usually bad. Yeah, and it depends on the tire too. A very 200 tread wear tire, they will chirp a little bit, but it shouldn't be a wail. It should be kind of a And the track surface also can have some impact. So
totally.
To not to necessarily sum up the answer, but this is how most of the answers to these will be. It's very gray, but what I would think through this, asking this question, Bill, would be take note of some of the questions that Robby was just asking, basically, and think through those things in as much detail as you can. And this is being recorded, so you can reference it later. But the reason that this is so valuable to hear what he says is because the questions that he's asking are the questions he's probably asking himself when he's trying to solve these same problems.
Yeah.
Right. Let's jump into real quick, Robby, the question that I sent you earlier that Edwin Jennings sent us, because I think it's a great topic and a great thing to cover before we progress any further. And if we don't get to your question now, folks, we'll try to wrap up the majority of our conversation. And towards the end of the webinar, we'll go through the questions in quick succession and make sure everything gets addressed. But Edwin said, going from high speed to threshold braking, I've been told you just slam on the brake initially. If you just slam on the brake initially, it is too fast for the weight transfer to move forward and thus not as good as quick, direct, more linear, and obviously quick pressure, which gives the weight time to transfer forward and thus have a strong initial braking force. Please comment on the initial application of brake pressure. Should it be an instant slam or take it just a bit longer, as in a small amount, maybe 1 or 2/10 of a second, to give time for the weight to transfer forward for stronger brake response? So slam on the brake pedal, throw the anchor out, brake as hard as possible, versus a little bit smoother brake, a little bit more feeding in brake, but potentially more effective.
Yeah, so I guess the difference would be slamming on the brake versus kind of rolling into it. And we touched on that earlier. And it's honestly very variable depending on what kind of car you're in, what kind of tire you're on. what track surface you're on. Is it wet? Is it dry? But for argument's sake, we'll just say it's dry, and you have good grip in general. But I would say for me in my career in different cars, we'll go back to maybe the Skip Barber MX-5 on the street tire. What you're talking about with, we'll call rolling into the brake, is very relevant. You can definitely, I call it overshock the front tire, because your weight transfer is extremely sudden, and in that car it's relatively softly sprung. There's not a lot of damper control relative to something with a stiffer platform. So there is a lot of pitch under braking, and that sudden weight transfer does do a lot to load the front, and you can overslip the front on the ABS initially. So for me, in the MX-5, I would definitely roll into the brake more than I would say in like the LMP3 prototype I drove with much more, well, it has downforce versus the MX-5 doesn't. It has a lot of downforce, a really big tire with a stiff sidewall has less suspension travel. There's less weight transfer under braking. Things are happening much quicker, and you have a lot more capability in aero, tire, or just grip in general. That you attack the brake pedal much harder initially, and you actually experience downforce loss in the corner, so you have to change your braking. I will say something interesting that you may have not have thought of is you can actually, the weight starts to transfer before you hit the brake pedal. As you lift off the throttle, the car is going to start to transfer weight forward. So the rate at which you lift is also something to be considered for a threshold brake and not a threshold brake. So I'll give you an example in the slower car in the MX-5. When you lift and right before you brake again, the rear is kind of lifting up in a sense, and you're putting more weight on the front, but it's happening slower. So if you lift off the throttle a little bit slower and apply the brake a little bit slower, that transition is happening slower, which in a lot of times is better. But I think the important thing to consider is you're still trying to maximize 100% of what the tire can handle. So in doing that, it would be very easy to underdrive that limit. Again, so in practice, the theory is kind of a quick transition, throttle to brake, and hitting the brake pretty hard pretty soon, because in general, that's going to be the most consistent way. Obviously, there's some fine tuning in that. Now, take the LMP3, for example. When you brake hard initially from a high speed, going down to a low speed, it's a much more aggressive hit of the brake. But the way you lift also transfers weight and changes the aero balance. So you could be a little bit tailed down in the rear for basically straight line speed and downforce. When you lift off, the rear of the car actually comes more to center, and you have a better platform for braking. So there's different techniques that really vary depending on your platform. I would say in general, if we're talking about a tire with a reasonable amount of grip but not a massive amount of grip, and you don't have a lot of downforce, you're trying to attack the brake to the limit of the tire, which would be, if you don't have ABS, basically to the limit of locking. If you're in a Spec Miata or a Spec E30, you know that it's very easy to lock the front tires on your initial hit of the brake, in that type of car. But it's not an exact black and white answer. It's very gray depending on what you're driving and what you're doing. But the theory is the exact same. You're just trying to maximize what the tire can handle. So hopefully that wasn't too convoluted and it made some sense. But everything you do with your feet is changing the weight balance and platform, what the car is doing dynamically as you're moving. So for sure you can manipulate that. But I would say, as a rule of thumb, attacking the brake pedal with a reasonable amount of aggression is always going to yield you the best result. It's a very fine-tuning ability to roll into the brake, maybe just under the limit of the ABS, and not overslip the front tire on the initial brake application.
Peter Krause commented and said that he calls it trying to get the car to squat instead of pitching onto the front tires. So that, I like using words that are very descriptive to what you feel in the car, because if you're pitching the car over to the front tires, it's like you pitch the car over and it's like all the weight's sitting on the front tires.
Yep.
That's a good way to know if you've overdone it. Because on a street car, like you said, if you just do that with the brake pedal, street car, street tire, you're going to go straight into ABS, and you probably did overload it.
Right.
Because if you
Totally.
get the
Yeah.
car to squat, that's a little
Yeah.
more controlled.
And that's a good way to put it. And you'll actually feel the car compress a little bit if if you're efficiently slowing the car down, the whole thing is kind of compressing into the tire. Yeah, it's very easy. I experience this a lot when I do different events just in street cars for, show or whatever. When you go and attack the brake pedal, you basically get what's called ice mode. And basically the sensors on the car realize that you've overslipped the tire and they think you're literally on ice because you've tried to brake so hard. The tire sees the same kind of slip characteristics that it would on ice, which is tricky to understand, but that's kind of what's happening.
Yeah, ice mode. We had that in the Accord that I ran in World Challenge.
Yeah, totally.
The brake pedal would just get stiff under your foot.
Yep.
And
The
nothing would happen.
MX-5's had that. Pretty much everything with the street-based ABS system has it. And even in you can overdo the ABS for sure in a lot of cars.
Yeah. We'll go through a couple questions real quick. And sorry, that wasn't Peter's comment, but that was Eldon's comment. So Eldon has a really cool Lotus if you're ever at the track. Very cool car.
Awesome.
So a couple things. Let's look at Peter's question here. And then, I'm sorry. Tim was asked actually the first question. Before we move on to the next topic, and then we'll quickly talk a little bit about if you're braking too early, how can you work up to braking a little later? And when your depth perception changes and the vision kind of the whole progression of the corner changes a little. So Tim says, as a training device, do you ever recommend threshold braking a little late, therefore missing the apex and then just moving the brake zone backward to hit the apex rather than moving the beginning of braking into the brake zone by changing your brake release?
So good question. I would say I would never recommend you braking on purpose too late because you never know where that's going to put you. Some corners there's very little risk, but some corners there's a lot of risk. The distinction would be my recommendation, or what I would try to teach people and what I do initially if I'm new to a track, new to a car, I brake a little bit early, but I maximize the straight line braking. So what you're saying is a common thing I see is you brake too early knowingly at the threshold pressure, and then you start to trail in a straight line to then adjust your speed based on your depth perception of what you see. So instead of doing that, I would challenge you to always brake at maximum threshold in a straight line. And when you find yourself overslowing the entry to the point where you're going too slow before you start to turn the wheel, then you shift the braking forward. It's very easy to get in what I call no man's land. I don't know if it's a great way to describe it. It's what I do. You brake too early. You start to trail too early because everything that we do, inputs in the car, is kind of based off what our eyes tell us to do, and it's all depth perception. So you're braking, you find your brake marker, you brake, you start to kind of look at the apex, and you're judging the speed and how your speed is changing relative to the apex, at least in that phase. Mm-hmm. So it's very easy to release the brake in a straight line and have a relatively decent corner and kind of become complacent with that. But I would challenge you to brake at the initial point, brake as hard as you can in a straight line, and then realize that you've kind of been on the brakes a bit too early. In practice, what you're asking works fine, and I honestly do that sometimes. I definitely kind of brake at the limit, realized I've kind of hit the brakes too late, and then backed up the braking. But conservatively, it's a much better approach to start by braking a little bit early. Make sure you hit the brake pressure, and I see that a lot nowadays. I do a lot of work in GT4 cars, and they have race ABS systems with no assist and no boosted brakes. So people coming from a street-based car in their PCA car or street car they've been driving to a GT4 car, the pedal pressure is over double, sometimes triple as much, sometimes hitting the brake with 100 bar of pressure or more, depending on the system. So I always tell people to make sure you're hitting the pressure early before you start to attack the corner late. So I would always recommend braking a little bit early, as hard as you can, and then shifting it later. I usually find that's more productive than the alternative.
That's something that I need to work on too, because as we talked about offline, what I tend to find, and a lot of people I find have the same issue, is I've actually gotten to the point where I'm very comfortable rolling entry speed, but I still have opportunity in the braking zone to compress the braking zone to where I go from my kind of threshold portion phase of the corner, which we're going to dovetail into here in a second, to my release in a shorter period of time, whereas I'm doing it maybe still braking a little earlier than I can. So I'm not really optimizing the entire braking zone, but I'm comfortable rolling the entry speed, and I'm comfortable kind of with how I'm releasing the brake, but now I need to push it. So something you said earlier, vision, our hands and our feet do what our vision tells it to do. When someone goes from braking at, let's say they're applying the brakes at the 4 board to where the car can actually do it, maybe at the 2 brake marker, your whole field of vision, your whole depth perception changes.
Yep.
So that's something to really respect, that because your depth perception changes so much, a lot of the reasons why we don't optimize what the car can do is not because we're not confident enough to do it, but it's purely because it looks different, and it's just challenging the norm. If you're used to doing it in a certain place, you're used to this comfort of, this is what I see when I do this. So how do you, as somebody that has to break through that barrier and be able to brake at the last possible second while not sacrificing entry speed, how do you go through that process if you're driving a new car at a new track and it's a little intimidating to brake at the last possible, at where the car needs to brake? How do you do that? Say you're at Road America in a new car.
Yeah, that's the best example I was going to give is Road America. I had driven there in Mazda MX-5s for years and years and years, and then I went back there for the first time in a GTD car. So I'm arriving at the corner like, I don't know, 60 miles an hour faster, but I'm braking at the same point. So, I guess to dive into the initial kind of point of why we're talking about this, when you start to brake late and you actually realize, okay, I can now brake at the 2, everything changes. The rate at which you're slowing down changes. The slope of your speed trace is much steeper. You're arriving at the corner faster. Everything that you used to do for 3-4 years is now different. And really, it's all down to what your eyes are doing, and everything is almost the same, but it's happening a little bit more rushed and a little bit quicker. You're going to brake later. You're going to have to start to trail earlier, and the rate at which you're doing things is going to increase. So for me, like Road America Turn 5 is a great example. When I first went there, relative to my teammates, I was braking slightly earlier, and I would release brake pressure. It's not really trailing normally, but I would release a bit of brake pressure, and I wasn't efficient in a straight line. And that's because visually, with the amount of speed I was carrying, probably doing something like 170, 160, something like that, to just arrive at the 2 board, you're looking at the 2 board going, well, I'm getting here pretty fast, and you think you basically get all the way there, but you don't. And then you realize the car's slowing down, so you start to give up the pressure and whatever. So how I always try to attack it and get over that barrier is, I say to myself, when my hands are dead straight, I have to floor the brake pedal as hard as I can. And in the GTD car, I can do that because I don't have a boosted brake system. They're completely manual brakes, and I have the ABS system. But that's the technique in that car. You whack the brake really quite hard, relative to a lot of the cars that I've driven in the past that you guys are maybe more accustomed to. But it's the same when you're in a global MX-5 Cup car or something with ABS or whatever, or something without ABS and a Spec Miata. When my hands are dead straight, I'm going to use 100% of the brake pedal that I can, just on the edge of locking, just on the edge of adhesion. And that at first will be quite messy. Your progression of the corner will be a little bit messy. You might brake a little bit late, a little bit early. You could have a low speed at turn-in. You could be doing a bunch of different things a little bit wrong, but you have to nail down that initial brake and the initial brake point. That's the first progression of the corner. That's going to set the tone for the rest of the corner. So I would say, in a general sense, when my hands are straight and I know I'm going to threshold brake, I just think to myself, maximize the ability to brake in a straight line. And that's really simply put, but I think it's very easy to not attack or not basically get to that last brake board and then not slow the car down to the ability that you actually have to slow it down.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes taking the opposite approach as well can be helpful for, depending on how you learn, depending on your comfort level as well. Eldon commented and said, Ross Bentley recommends working on the end of brake before the beginning of brake, which is something that he does talk about a lot. Get the brake release progression right first, because a
Yep.
lot of what you're saying about maximizing and optimizing, you have a very, very good brake release and a very good practiced understanding of how the brake
Yeah.
release has to work. So that is an important component that you can't ignore. We can't just do exactly what Robby's saying, optimize the brakes, and then for the trailing off phase of the corner, just pop off the brakes and turn the wheel, right?
Yeah. So exactly what what Ross is describing, the end of brake, is extremely relevant, and it's probably the hardest and the point at which you'll find the most lap time in your driving career, where the last 3 to 5 seconds is over a pro. So if we're describing this, if you had a perfect end of brake trace, what you would see is a slightly different trace at the beginning. The perfect optimal way would be a later trace at a higher pressure, but your end of the brake trace would be the same. So you would still be having the same kind of trailing off phase, which is, that is definitely relevant and something that you should be working on. And it's definitely less intimidating, especially in a high speed situation where you're losing 60 miles an hour in a brake zone, or something even more, maybe over 100 miles an hour.
Yeah.
So that's definitely super relevant. It's, for me, myself, I always, maybe this is because I have more experience and I know what I need to feel out of the car to trail the brake and et cetera, but I always struggle with more of the initial brake, because that sets the tone for me. If I don't hit the initial brake completely right at the right point, then my end of brake phase is a little bit off, and different things like that.
Yeah.
And there's different challenges that we experience in practical real world with saving fuel and whatever. But yeah, your end of the trace should always look the same no matter how you attack the beginning portion of the brake. But myself, I struggle with, if I don't hit the right pressure at the right point as late as possible on the limit, I struggle with the end of brake phase and trailing and getting the exact right rotation out of the car.
Absolutely. Well, if you're not carrying the same amount of speed, or you're not transferring the same amount of weight to the front, the car's not going to respond the same way. So it's in my opinion, and I like Ross's approach a lot, but I also think what you're saying, I think you have to come at it from both ends. You have to obviously work on both, but more understand what you need out of both ends of the braking zone. So this is a really good question. And guys, if you have questions that you want answered, there's 3 that we haven't gotten to so far. We'll get to those at the end, because we're going to make sure that we get through our regularly scheduled programming. So leave your questions in the Q&A that you want to be answered, and any questions that you have. If someone's asking a question and you want clarification from them, enter that in the chat window. That'll make that a little bit easier. All we're going to keep track of as far as official questions go. So guys, if you have a question sitting in Q&A, we'll get to it shortly. So this whole first part of the conversation is what we're going to define as phase 1 of the braking zone, which is the initial application. So that's the top of the speed trace, the sawtooth shape that's in the video that I sent you guys as a follow-up. That's what we want that initial brake application to look like. Basically, as efficiently as possible, we want to transition from wide open throttle to our threshold application of the brakes. The second phase, Robby, what's that phase 2 going to be? What do we want to talk about there? That's
for me, I think this is something that's not talked about enough, maybe, but and I kind of described it like in a Turn 5 Road America example, holding that peak pressure, or it's not even necessarily holding, you could actually in fact be releasing, but maintaining a threshold with the tire in a straight line on the brakes. So most people think initial hit right into the trail, which is a lot of times true depending on the car, but especially in a turn like, again, we'll use Turn 5 Road America, you end up holding, even in a car with a lot of downforce, you end up holding a very high pressure for a good amount of time in a straight line. And if you're not braking as late as you can. So that's something I kind of describe I struggle with initially when I first went there in the first 10 laps, is I was braking a little bit early at the correct peak pressure, but I was releasing the pressure too fast, too soon, and I wasn't efficient. My speed trace, the slope of my speed trace relative to my teammates was not as steep, and I wasn't using 100% of what the car could do. in my first few laps there, and I would say on average it wasn't much time, but if you think about it, probably a half a tenth in every brake zone, and there's a large amount of brake zones there, so that's probably a few tenths just in braking, which obviously adds up. So for me, we talk about the initial hit. Secondarily to that is maintaining a peak pressure in a threshold situation, which is extremely variable based on the corner. If you have a long brake zone where you're losing a lot of speed, that phase is going to be much longer over a corner. Like we could talk about Road Atlanta 10A. You have a long threshold brake or a long decel period where you lose a lot of speed in turn 10, but turn 6 you don't lose as much speed. So I think it's important to distinguish threshold braking to basically maximizing your straight line braking ability. So for me, the second phase of braking after the initial application is maintaining your threshold pressure in a straight line, which is sometimes a long duration. It's sometimes not long at all. It could be could be a few tenths of a second. It could be a second and a half. It's very variable. So
this is probably the most variable phase of the brake zone, because in a corner, like you said, high speed entry, long threshold braking period, you're going to be maintaining pressure. So if you're going into a corner, and we can use kind of the radius of the corner to kind of help define what that should look like. If you're going at a high speed into a corner with a tight radius, meaning a tight turn, then you're probably going to be holding that threshold pressure for a while, right? So turn 10 at Road Atlanta, the back straightaway at VIR, turn 13, which has an extra element because it adds going uphill, and altitude and elevation changes obviously also affect the threshold of the tire. So when Robby also says in that phase 1, attacking the brake pedal, braking at the threshold of the tire, if you're applying the brakes on a crest, that's different than applying the brakes where the track's leveling out and starting to go back uphill, because the limit of the tire is going to be different because it's unloaded on the crest and it's loaded on the depression. So that comes into it as well. But some other corners with these long duration braking zones, turn 7 at Sebring, which we have some data from. A lot of places at Road America, turn 5, Canada corner.
I think a good example too, if we have anybody from kind of the center of the country that goes to Mid-Ohio, is you can brake harder into turn 2 if you're running the pro course in Mid-Ohio than you can off the backstretch, because you're going up a hill versus down a hill. So your threshold brake pressure is different, but you're still braking at a threshold with whatever the tire can handle. Your level of grip is just slightly different. So I think that's an important distinction. Instead of just considering the threshold brake, the absolute hardest my car can brake and slow down, it's a little bit more variable than that.
Absolutely. So that's our second phase. We've got our initial application, then we've got the holding of the brake pressure, or basically efficiently slowing the car down for our corner entry speed. We're basically trying to slow the car down to the point at which we can add steering and turn in. And then the last phase of the corner we've already talked about just a little bit, but arguably the most important phase in a lot of ways. What's that last phase, Robby? That's the release, right?
Yeah, it's your trail or release, which in itself has a few different phases, but that's the last bit. So as you're starting to transition the car into the corner, you're transferring a lot of weight. You're using our steering angle, and we're trying to basically maximize the limit of the tire in that sense. So a lot of things that you guys have probably heard in the past, like the string theory, that all applies. We're just trying to use 100% of what the tire can do. So a really good simple way to kind of understand it is, if I'm using 100% of the tire to brake in a straight line, that's great. My hands have to be straight. As soon as I start to induce wheel in the car, I have to give up some of that pressure to allow the tire to accept more of a lateral load. So that also comes into play when you're looking at G traces and your friction circle. That's the difference between a smooth kind of circle versus a lot of jagged lines and different things that you'll maybe see. So and as kind of described before, it's the hardest phase, I think, to teach, and the hardest phase to develop a good feel for, and where you will find the most lap time. I think sometimes people interpret what the car should be doing in that phase in the wrong way. A lot of people talk about like coasting versus not coasting. And I think an important distinction to make is at the end of the trailing brake phase, the end, or the EOB, as a lot of you guys know it as, there is a very small pause or coast phase, and it's variable depending on the corner in the car and a lot of different things. But the car should always be changing speed in that progression. And you may think you're coasting because you're off the pedals, but you're still actually decelling as you add wheel and get to the apex. And I kind of describe it as it's the last little bit of turn the car needs. You're letting the car rotate the last little bit, get the front pointed in the right direction before you apply the throttle. That's at the end of the release phase, which is kind of a coasting phase. It's a pause phase. There's a lot of different ways to describe it.
Yeah, hesitation, maybe.
Hesitation, yeah. All good words to describe what's going on. And that is probably, in combination with how you release the brake and turn the wheel, the most important thing for getting the car angled right for the exit.
Yeah, Eldon commented in the chat, and Edwin, I see your question as well. If you can put that in the chat box or in the Q&A box, there we go. Good deal. Eldon said something relevant to that, and he was saying, basically, if you start releasing the brake too early, you're not going to have the proper amount of weight on the nose to help the car turn and complete that turning phase. So when you're talking about the coasting phase, so we've got our initial application, we've got holding brake pressure, we've got the brake release, and then the brake release kind of trails off into the coasting or the hesitation or the last little bit that the car needs to turn before you go back to throttle. And usually it's almost imperceptible, but if you are releasing the brake, if you're carrying the proper amount of entry speed, you'll know you do it right, because there's a little hesitation mid-corner where you can't actually apply the throttle.
Yep.
Because it would be, pushing the tire too far past the limit.
Yeah, and then you would be, in a sense, late to full throttle, for sure. Basically picking up the throttle too early and then late to full throttle is a very common thing that we see. Yeah, I think what's also important to touch on in talking about what your release does to rotation, or does it give it understeer, oversteer? And again, that's varying. If you release the brake in a straight line a little bit too soon and you take some weight off the front, you may induce an understeer in the car simply because you have probably too much speed going in and you're overslipping the front tire. But you can also induce oversteer with your brake release if it's happening late with speed. So there's not necessarily a single distinction there. It's a little bit variable based on where you are in the corner and where the weight of the car is relative to how much grip the tire has, which I think is important to describe. Where I learned the most myself about trail braking was, again, going back to the old NC MX-5 on the street tires, is I could totally manipulate the car with entry speed rolling off the brake. I had very little wheel, and I was rotating the car purely with the brake release. So I wasn't getting oversteer in a sense, but I was getting some slip angle and turn out of the car by just trailing the brake relative to, I had relatively little steering. It's almost like we used to call it a zero steer, where you're having not necessarily a slide. There's some slip angle where you're having to come out of the wheel slightly.
Yeah.
But your manipulation of the brake and trailing off the brake has different effects in different points based on different things. So it's a little bit more detailed than that. But
Zero steer would be defined in my mind, and I think this is partly from reading a book that Paul Girard wrote. It's where the rear tires are slipping at a slightly higher slip angle than the front tires.
Yep.
So the car is actually actively pointing itself towards your exit, and that's what your brake release is kind of trying to achieve in a lot of ways.
Yep. And in a street-based tire, it's much more prevalent than in for instance, in the IMSA cars now and the GT cars with the P3 on the Michelin, that doesn't really exist. And any slip angle that you're seeing over, basically the limit of the tire and the amount of grip it has is so much greater than that of a slip angle. So if you were to slip the tire, you would lose so much grip that it would kind of go very quickly. So you're not looking for any slip. The street-based tire, or something with a little bit more tread and or less grip and different characteristics, a little bit more pliable in some cases, allows for more slip angle, and it's actually better. Like even a bias ply versus a radial, if you're talking about older kind of slick racing tires, a bias ply likes more slip angle. I know, Andrew, you have a lot of experience with that with your old stock car and different techniques and ways to drive it, but It's definitely all a little bit variable. There's no zero steer phase in a quick lap in a GT3 car, where there can be in a Spec Miata or something else like that. So yeah,
the
it's
tire
a
makes a big difference.
Yep, totally.
Yeah, let's guys keep asking those questions. We have two quick data examples to look at to define these braking phases. So we're going to do that and wrap that up in about little less than 10 minutes, and then we'll jump straight into the Q&A at the end. And maybe Robby will even share some more stories from behind the wheel at the Daytona 24 and some other cool stuff like that. So really quickly, let me pull up some data. And if you've been on our webinar series over this past coronavirus season, you might be familiar with the data. This is me driving a 2020 Honda Civic on all season tires. I'm not going to name the rental car agency, but it was a rental car. And the reason we're going to look at this is because it's a very good example of a car that can brake more efficiently. The brakes are more powerful than the tires have grip. So we want to just look at this speed trace right here. And let me isolate what we're looking at, and then we're going to define based on the speed trace. So folks out there that aren't data users, this is our speed versus distance graph. So across the bottom, we have distance plotted over the lap over the course of the racetrack here. And then on the left side, we've got our speed. This is Sebring International Raceway. And I've isolated this area that you see in the circle. And I'm going to draw, as soon as I can find my arrow here, I'm going to show you guys which corner this is. This is this braking zone and this corner entry phase. So we've got our initial application, and that's going to be where we start to accelerate out of the corner. So let's just put some colored arrows here, Robby, to show the three phases. So guys, if you're looking at data at home and you're wanting to relate what we talked about tonight, this is a good example of that long middle phase. So high speed to low speed style corner. So I'm going to put a red arrow on the initial application. How does that initial application look, Robby? And what would you say, this has 600 tread wear street tires, very, very low grip. What are your thoughts on initial application here as far as the shape? What should people be looking for in their own data?
Yeah, so this is a great example of a question we had earlier about maybe a situation where you would have to roll into the brake a little bit more because you don't have the available grip, and the limit of the tire is quite low relative to maybe the capability of the car. Obviously, it's a rental car, but it's still a very relevant example. And I think a good thought for this also is the speed relative to where you're attacking the brake. You can see the slope of the speed trace is a little bit less steep than maybe the next decel in turn 10 because you're going at a slower speed. So the speed of the car is basically over exemplifying the weight transfer because of basic physics, right? So here Andrew's having to roll into the brake a little bit more to not overslip the front tire, get into this weird ABS ice mode type of thing. And then shortly after that, he has a pretty good speed trace drop off, a nice slope that we're seeing. And as he said, like we talked about before, the second phase of the corner is really pretty long. He's coming from, call it 100, 105 miles an hour, about 100, to all the way down to 30 at the apex. So he's losing 70 miles an hour here. So he's holding a very constant brake pressure for a pretty long amount of time as he brakes into turn 7. So that phase is quite long. Into the third phase, which we can see where he starts to trail off the brake and turn in, and that's basically at a different slope. And you can see right in your speed trace where this is happening because you notice the speed is now not coming off quite as quickly. So there he's starting to add wheel and trail the brake in that last phase of the corner. So here, this is a perfect example of a braking situation where you're going to have to lose a lot of speed and you're at a threshold brake for a very long time. Even in basically how we're describing it, you're still at a threshold brake in the trailing phase because you're using the max amount of brake pressure you can. But when we talk about threshold braking, we're talking about, in general, maximizing the straight line. So this is a really, really great example of a situation where you're getting to the max brake pressure as quickly as you can, which in this case is actually by not attacking the brake pedal with massive aggression as hard as possible. So You
Yeah.
can kind of identify the three phases on your own in your own data. And, some differences would be if Andrew were to brake a little bit earlier, a little bit lighter, he wouldn't have the same slope over the same amount of distance. So distance versus speed is very relevant for lap time.
More like that.
Yeah, which is definitely not as efficient in slowing the car down, and he would lose multiple tenths of a second just in the braking phase. Even if his trail was similar and the end of his braking trace looked the exact same, he would just have lost some time in the beginning portion of the brake zone. So it's a great example for that.
And the distinction I'll make here, and something I'll point out quickly before I even do that, is going to be this bump that I see where the second phase of the brake zone is, which is this kind of long hold of slowing the car down, which in this car was a very heavy ABS intervention because it's an all-season street tire. So any kind of major grip changes are going to, any attack of the brake pedal, any undulations in the track, all that's going to induce ABS pretty easily. And so you can actually see this little, where the pink arrow is pointing, the slope is pretty constant, and then it starts to change a little bit right here. And what you actually see that same condition occur in this brake zone as well. And I was pretty respective of adding brake pressure because I knew if I shocked the braking system, attacked the brakes, I'd get ABS initially. But then I got into it and I was holding it. I'm holding as much brake pressure as I could. And that's the point at which the ABS is probably intervening and actually slowing my rate of deceleration a little bit, is where you see that. I don't actually have the data that says there was ABS there, but that's what I think from what I remember feeling it and what I would probably see if I looked at longitudinal G. So without going into too much detail, what I would recommend doing is looking at your own data. And if you're in a car that's on maybe a 200 treadwear R comp, a slick, or you're in a car that's more capable than this car, you're going to want the top of your speed trace, just like in the video. You're going to want this kind of aggressive top of the speed trace where you're wasting no time going from wide open throttle to braking. And you can manipulate the speed trace to, if I actually zoom out of the speed trace, I get more of a sawtooth shape here, right? So it's also a little bit of perception bias, but you want to avoid that kind of flowing top to the speed trace in general. But those are just how we would look at the three phase of the corner in a speed trace. Would be that initial sawtooth shape is phase one, how the angle of your slope looks is phase two, and then where does that final change happen, and that's phase three. So that's in a longer corner. It's going to look a little different in a more compressed corner. The phases are going to be closer together. The holding phase might be very, very short. But those are things that you can look at just with a speed trace and gain a lot of insight from. So I think we had a good number of questions to get to. So I wanted to wrap that up pretty quickly. Is there anything you wanted to add there, Robby?
No, I think it's all well said. And yeah, the slope of the speed trace is a very good indication of how well you're slowing the car down, and it's going to be very different depending on the car. If you compare this car to a prototype or GT car, the slope would start much later and be much steeper. So it's all relative, which is something to consider, and it's very hard to define these limits without knowing very specific details about the car or having some comparison. That's why it's great to be able to use the functionality of the Apex Pro and be able to compare. You could, whether you're comparing with buddies or whatever. So yeah, I think it's important to consider, that the way that will look is going to be very different for a corner where the progression of the brake zone it's more condensed and everything happens much quicker because you're not changing as much speed. It has to do with your speed delta from the time you hit the brake to the apex speed, basically. So
and we didn't touch a lot on the release phase primarily because it's such a diverse, like you said, defining the limits for where should you release the brake, at what rate should you release the brake. There's so many millions of different things that come into that equation. The rough and dirty answer is keep the tire at the limit the entire way through the corner and don't sacrifice your exit. So it's a hard answer. So we didn't quite go into the end of braking phase, the the release phase, the coast phase quite as much because there's so much meat there. So maybe we can follow up and do that. Peter Krause says trust the lights takes into account all the relativity, which is a great point. The Apex display is going to take into account the surface changes and the surface conditions. So if you're let's say you're struggling with getting to that hard initial brake pressure in a corner that the car feels a little unsettled in, rely on the display a little bit, whether in real time or in replaying what the display was showing you in the app. And if you're seeing red lights there, you can be pretty confident that you've got more potential to go after that brake pedal and use a little more aggressive initial application. Let's hop into the Q&A real quick, and we'll just start at the top and work down. Peter has a really interesting question, and I'm sorry we couldn't get to this when we were on the topic, Peter, but I wanted to make sure that we addressed it because it's a good question. He says, Robby, to follow up on rise time, how much time it takes to get from initial application to maximum pressure and decel. What is the number you would look for on that on average in time? 0.35 seconds, obviously different from an MX5 to LMP3 to GTD, but what is the benchmark for a well-controlled platform? So he's basically asking the rise time, which is when you first hit the brakes, how much time does it take from that initial application to max decel in seconds?
Yeah, and that's a great question, and it's something that we actually, in some different situations in data, have actually really analyzed in different cars, and there's different terms for it. Some people call it like a lag time, or there's a really fancy engineering term that's not necessarily accurate called hysteresis, but it's not really well used. But yeah, it's very variable. I would say that the driver who has the ability to basically limit that time as much as possible is probably going to be the fastest. But in actual practice, I would probably say it's something like probably 2/10 to 3/10 in a car like an MX5, something like that, where like the LMP3 it's not instantaneous, but like the most instantaneous would be an F1 car where you couldn't even blink in the amount of time that it takes. But the P3 is probably, I would say 10% of what the MX5 would be. So something less than a tenth of a second for sure. It's hard to say, and it's variable based on what kind of setup you're running and your dynamic rake in a car with downforce and different rake and platform. But you'll see a much bigger variance in that between like a global MX5 Cup car or an NC MX5 versus a LMP3. LMP3 versus GT3 would be something that's closer, but for sure the P3 would probably be a good few hundredths of a second faster in that time. So there's also the same question in how long it takes like your steering input to actually be felt by the car, or like if you drive something with soft springs, a lot of suspension travel, it takes longer for your actual input to basically have an output. So that's one thing when we talk about braking later and your muscle memory and your depth perception. It's all kind of around the same theory. Is all that stuff is happening a little bit quicker. So what does your input? What is the output of what exactly you're giving the car? So that's a good question.
Yeah,
for sure,
and very interesting thing to think about. Austin Bucket's question's next, and he says, first of all, it's great to meet you. He noticed that you thrashed him yesterday in the MA GTE on iRacing. So that's good. That's funny. Related to how you get your braking feel online without weight shift feel. So the question's about simulator versus real life. I'm struggling to maintain grip around mid-corner online, possibly staying too hard on trail, turning too much, or both, but essentially sliding the front through or around the apex. So he's sliding the front tires around the apex, around the apex of the corner. Very hard to detect online, but real life applies too. How do I correct it? Stay in place and wait for grip to come back, or modulate brake steering, or both?
So I'm going to guess you're talking about Zandvoort, which I did a race last night. A good example of that would be turn 1 at Zandvoort. So based on what you're describing, I'm going to guess that you're not maximizing your braking in a straight line. Now, it is very hard. You don't feel pitch unless you have some crazy motion simulator. But you can see the pitch visually on the screen normally. Not that that's a great indicator, but I use the lockup lights, which we have in real life, and you actually do use. So it's a visual cue. And I set the brake bias to, on my initial hit, I'm kind of having some rear locking, not a massive amount, but I have a little bit of rear locking. And then as I trail off the brake, there's some bias migration to the front. So in reality, what you're experiencing is you're maybe braking at the right point, but you're not, you need more brake pressure in a straight line. And then you need to basically slow the car down a little bit more before you turn in. Yeah, your second phase of the brake zone is a little bit off. So you need a longer second phase, basically, slightly. And then as you trail the brake, you probably have a little bit too much speed in the wrong position, the wrong spot in the corner. So if you maybe start by braking at the same point, try to brake harder for longer, I would suggest from the baseline setup. I'll give you some tips. Crank the bias to the rear to somewhere in the 53% range from 56. And yeah, hold the brake a little bit longer while your hands are straight, which is, again, in that car into turn one, not really that long. I mean, I'm braking just after the 100 board, and you arrive at the corner very quickly. But if you're sliding through the corner at the apex and you're not locking the wheels, you have too much speed at the apex. But I'd be willing to bet if we compared our data, you would be braking probably earlier than I am, not as harder for as long, and your speed trace would not have the same slope initially, but it would be basically less steep, and you would then we would kind of cross paths, and you would have too much speed just after turning to the apex, and you'd be later to throttle. So I'm sort of maximizing the entry and the exit a little bit more. You need to maximize your ability to brake in a straight line and give up some brake as you turn the car a little bit more, probably at a lower speed, point the car sooner, and then get to the throttle nice and cleanly. So that's, a good question. And I'm glad, I could help you relative to iRacing, but for sure, crank the bias a bit to the rear. It's really easy to lock the fronts in the M8 on the baseline. So try that.
iRacing, and that's a great point when you're in the sim, because like he said, you don't have in real life, you have the feel of how much the car is pitching, and you don't have that in the sim, but it does make you a little more attuned to some of the other smaller cues that happen when you apply the brakes, like the angle of the horizon and some other things like that. Edwin's got a really good question. He says, in phase 2, maintaining maximum threshold pressure, are you gradually lifting brake pressure, or is it more constant brake pressure? I'm sure it depends on the tire, but can you typify it for street tires versus race tires?
Sure. It definitely depends on the tire, but I would more say it depends on the type of car. So let's talk street tires, for instance. Unless you were doing like a time attack type thing where you had like a lot of aero and not a very good tire, but in a car with a lot of power, you're not going to really see much aero loss. So you're kind of maintaining more of a constant pressure. Same thing on a race tire. A little bit depends on the car, but like in a Spec Miata, for example, if you're in one of those, you're maintaining that pressure in a straight line. The brake zones aren't very long because they have a lot of grip in general. They don't have a lot of power, and they're pretty light. So they slow down well, but you don't have to lose that much speed. But still, you're more maintaining that pressure. If you take like a prototype open wheel high downforce car, for example, or even a GT car, like a GTLM or a GT3, you actually are lifting a bit of brake pressure as you go. The GT3, you don't necessarily have to as long as your hands are straight because you have the ABS, but it's still a bit better to basically not use that as your crutch. For sure in the GTLM with no ABS, you're doing that. The P3, DPI, IndyCar, Indy Lights, stuff like that.
You have driven the GTLM car too, right?
Yes. It's supposed to be a secret, but you heard it here first.
We won't tell anybody.
Yeah, I did a test in that. And that was the first GT car with a lot of downforce I drove that didn't have ABS. So it was a bit of a challenge, a different technique to the P3, just based on the dynamics of the car. So I would say it's more relatively dependent on the car. But I can give you an example that may make sense and answer your question. If we talk a race car on rain tires versus dry tires in the rain versus the dry. In the wet, your brake pressure will be less, and you will probably have to, you can use the downforce advantage you have earlier, but you have to get out of it much sooner. So the trace looks really weird. You kind of hit the brake hard, you trail to the point of the limit of grip, and then you hold a little bit later to the limit of the tire because the tire has so much more available to you because of the downforce early on. So that's a little bit of a different kind of situation, but in general, it's more dependent on the car than the tire. But 80% of the time, for what we're all talking about here in the cars that we're driving, it's more of a hold of the same pressure.
Gotcha. Guys, let's go ahead and close out the Q&A. So if you have a question, you can send it to me in the email, and I can send it to Robby and get that after this. But we need to start wrapping it up. So we're not going to take any more questions than what's currently in the Q&A, and we'll work through these pretty quickly. One in particular that Tim mentioned, left foot versus right foot braking, which we intended to get to. We're just running out of time. Let's go to size question really quickly, and in a couple of minutes here. Could you please take us through an example of all phases for a fast corner, such as turn 1 at Road Atlanta? So fast corner, how's that different from the threshold, long threshold period, slower corner?
Yep. So I've never driven a car at Road Atlanta, and I don't think there really is one, where you brake at a maximum pressure into turn 1. So a good way to explain this is your change in speed is not really that much from the time you brake to the time you turn in. So you're really turning in shortly after you brake. So you'll have an initial pressure. I would say 9 times out of 10, it's like a 60% brake, like a 6 out of 10. And then shortly after, you're starting to turn, and then you're trailing. So it's the speed trace looks like an initial drop, but it's the slope is a little bit less aggressive, and your braking trace is still long. In a lot of cars, a lot of people stab the brake, get off, and then turn in, which I'm not a fan of there. I go for a little lighter of a pressure for longer. So you'll see more of a gradual speed trace drop off, but still should be linear, more or less, all the way to the apex, and then you're accelerating off. So your application phase and your holding pressure phase will be very short relative to like turn 10A. And then your trailing phase will actually be longer than your application and holding phase, which is quite different than an example we talked about before. So hopefully that makes sense. But the idea for there is the radius is very big. You have a lot of camber and elevation change to help you at the apex and give the car more grip. So your brake release phase is actually probably the longest, depending on the car. But
the summary that I heard is in a fast corner, like turn 1 or at Atlanta, you're probably going to have a longer release phase, and your initial slowing phase is going to be a little bit shorter.
Yep.
And that longer release phase also in part has to do with that you're entering with more speed. So you don't want to have a ton of brake pressure if you're turning the wheel and you got all the weight stuffed over the nose and you're going really fast and you're going too fast, the car might turn too much, which is not as desirable.
Yeah. Or you could overslow the entry. Like in the MX-5, you probably brake at like a 3 out of 10. And I try to carry it after I turn in. And then I have a pretty long coasting phase, but I'm still slowing down to the apex or just before. And obviously it's quite important to get to the throttle as early as possible to get up the hill. But the slopes of those different phases will look a lot different at a different distance. So you'll see, I would say, as opposed to like turn 10, the phases will be a similar duration, where typically, like into turn 10, your holding brake phase, where you're still losing the majority of your speed, is much longer. Those 3 phases in turn 1 will be a very similar duration in time and distance, really.
Gotcha. Let's jump into Edwin's question. Can you discuss TBO, trailing brake oversteer, and how and when to induce it in rotation? We'll keep it just a couple minutes here.
Yeah. So to me, oversteer is something you don't really want intentionally. Rotation is good. Oversteer is when you're overslipping the tire too much, and you're really losing time because you're over the limit. Slip angle is okay. So we'll talk about slip angle and trailing the brake to initiate the turn. and it's a little bit variable again, but if you maximize your ability to brake in a straight line and you get to the turning point, as you transition the car from braking in a straight line to turning, you're loading let's say you're turning right, you're loading the outside left front tire first, really, and then it kind of transfers to the rear and how you load the car laterally. Basically, the trail brake phase helps determine how the car loads laterally. So trail brake oversteer in a lot of cars is the fact that you probably released the brake too early and you made that weight transfer very sudden, and kind of you pivoted on the outside left front and then you lose the rear. That's most of the time. A lot of times also you can carry too much brake for too long, and some cars you can actually kind of have some rear locking. But in general, I would say 9 times out of 10, you've released the brake too aggressively, too soon, and lost the rear. Like in the Skip Arbor MX-5, that used to be very prevalent because that's how you kind of turn the car. And if you popped off the brake too much, added too much wheel, at the same time, you overloaded that left front and then lost the rear. So, you know, there's some different reasons for that happening, which would take a long time to kind of go through, but that's the quick version. And yeah, that also in effect really unloads the rear very aggressively too. And then kind of overslips, you're overdoing everything on the left side tires, basically, if you're turning right.
Let's look at Tim's question real quick, because we did put this discussion point in the kind of topics to discuss. And he's talking about left foot versus right foot braking.
Yep.
So with the manual transmission, and I think that's a really good point, left foot braking, left foot training, what can you do if you have 3 pedals and use left foot braking? And I know I have a couple thoughts because I've driven a lot of front wheel drive cars and used a little bit of left foot braking in situations. But what are your thoughts on maybe with a 2 pedal car, someone that, first of all, do you left foot brake? And second of all, what should someone be looking to do there?
Yeah, so for me, I do left foot brake in some cars and I right foot brake in others. I left foot brake in the GTD car, the LMP3, most GT4s, and it has to do with kind of what Peter was talking about in the time it actually takes for the car to sort of see your brake input. For me, in cars like the P3, where that happens quite quickly, and it's harder to overload the front of the car, overload the front tires. I left foot brake just purely based on the speed. I'm on the gas, I lift and brake. Now, we could talk about different scenarios where at, you know, Daytona, there may be a longer lift before you brake, but in general, that's the technique I use for those cars. You can certainly left foot brake a car with 3 pedals, and I have done in the past when I'm not downshifting. But like take the MX-5 Cup car, for example, I didn't find it advantageous for myself to left foot brake that car simply because the time that it took for the car to receive my input and basically give me an output, it's kind of the way I've been describing it, was long, and I would actually overload the front of the car or kind of get into the ice mode or whatever. I would do too much for what the car could basically take with the tire while left foot braking. So it's a little bit down to preference too. There's a lot of really, really good drivers that right foot brake all cars. Like my teammate Bill Arberlin is a right foot braker. He doesn't left foot brake at all, just to maybe warm the brakes or warm the tires. But when he's driving at his maximum, he's right foot braking. And his technique is totally pretty similar to mine of left foot braking. He just moves his right foot very, very fast. So in a manual trans, you can left foot brake. It's a little bit down to preference. I think there's a lot of bad habits you can develop from left foot braking, but there's also a lot of advantages to it. So that's another in-depth discussion. And I think it's a little bit down to preference. I prefer to left foot brake the big fast cars where I feel that I gain a small advantage in the amount of time I save left and right foot braking. But in some sense, I have to be careful because I can use more fuel left foot braking. Sometimes I have to be conscious of my lift off the throttle and brake, or when I'm trying to save fuel. So it's a little bit about adapting your own technique, I think.
Yeah, I want to attack it from a couple different ways, because a lot of us now drive cars that don't have a third pedal, where maybe it's a street car, GT3 with a PDK or a GT4 Cayman. And you can left foot brake all the time if you want to. And I think the upside is that you get a quicker transition in phase one, initial application. You get that you can almost even overlap, right, and go immediately. You don't really want to overlap throttle and brake input ever, but you can go immediately to brakes with very little hesitation. And you also can have a really, really precise brake release and an immediate throttle application if desired. The downside to that is we talked a lot about the coast phase, which if we're at the limit of the tire laterally in the middle of the corner and you're left foot braking, you might be more eager to go back to throttle too soon as a left foot braker with two pedals principally.
Yeah, totally.
In three pedal cars, I have seen people that actually will brake and downshift with their right foot. And then for the end of the braking zone for phase three, they'll slip their left foot over and do a left foot brake release, so they have less transition time off the brake on the throttle.
Yeah,
I've never found that. Yeah, to me that's a little complicated. Where I've used left foot braking in a three pedal car is in brake zones where I don't need to downshift, and principally because it was a front wheel drive car and in a longer duration corner, if I had to brake like turn 2 and 3 at Barber, I could actually roll in with the left foot on the brake and almost overlap the throttle, because the diff, when I had the throttle applied, the front differential would actively kind of lock and help the car turn. And so I wanted the weight transfer on the front to maximize that throttle input. It really only happened once the tires got warm too. When the tires were really good, it wasn't something you had to do. So the main reason I wanted to bring that up was to give you a decision-making matrix. If you have a two-pedal car and you're asking yourself, should I left foot brake? I think what Robby said is all you need to consider, which is how quick will the car respond to your brake input? And if it's instantaneous response, there's probably big benefit in left foot braking. If it's a relatively softly sprung car, and that might even be, like you said, not all GT4 cars you left foot brake in, you might not need to worry about training that skill. But certainly something worth practicing. Very cool. Peter says on the lockup lights, and we've got 3 more questions that we'll go through quickly, and then we'll wrap it up because we're coming up on an hour and a half here. So on the lockup lights, are you looking at a specific wheel speed differential percentage from rolling for that alarm on the GTD car? So he's asking, when you see lockup lights, is it looking at the difference in wheel speeds or something else?
So the lockup, we don't necessarily have lockup lights in the GTD car. We have some ABS interaction, or that's in the M6. In other cars, there is basically front ABS lights and rear ABS lights, and you're trying to use those a little bit. But the lockup lights more come in the GT-LM or prototype cars. And yeah, in general, it's not. I think it's a little bit variable based on how it's programmed, and it's a little bit subjective because I think it takes in a little bit more data. But yeah, you're looking at a wheel speed relationship between the front and the rear tires and the inside and outside front. So you can lock both fronts for sure, but it looks at the rate of change in the wheel speeds basically in that relationship. And I think a lot of times your front and rear wheel speeds are quite different, but there is a relationship basically versus, as you just said, basically car speed versus wheel speed. And that's probably the most, the best way to describe it. I think
Peter said so difference in drive speed versus ground speed.
Yeah, like the actual speed of the chassis versus the wheel speed. And the relationship between both wheels. And it's very, very advanced where they're actually variable. So you have lights that flicker where you're like on the edge of it, and then it kind of builds from there. Same with traction control lights. Traction control lights are a little bit simpler. They're based on a wheel slip relationship between the front and the rear, and you're changing that all the time. But
so you're using these points of real-time feedback in the car to, just like you would with your Apex Pro display if you see red lights mid-corner.
Totally. So honestly, a lot of people are apprehensive to the fact of having real-time, call it visual cues, but we use them at the highest level in racing all the time. So I think it's a very good way. And, just like we say with the Apex, trust the lights, it's similar in those cars where they give you extra information that are, really beneficial to maximizing your lap time.
Really interesting stuff. I didn't know a ton about lockup lights, but that's cool.
Yeah, they're pretty cool.
Know more. So we got one more question, and then Richard, I'll tackle your question last, just because it's a nice wrap up. We have the question: what about left foot braking to make sure your brakes are set while under throttle? And that usually refers to pad knockback.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I do that a lot because I've had a few bad experiences where I've lost the brakes, and that's not good. Luckily, always in a spot where I could kind of get out of it, but it definitely stinks to realize you have no brakes when you need to actually slow down a lot. So I would just advise you to try to do it as light as possible. You don't want to like whale into the brake for two reasons. You don't want to like lose straightaway speed, but also can be harmful to the brakes, and you can kind of superheat the surface of the pad, and you can glaze your brake pads by doing that. But yeah, for sure I do it, especially in cars with no knockback springs. We have in the GT cars basically springs in the caliper that try to prevent the knockback from happening. So it's more relevant. Yeah, and like I've done it a lot in Spec Miatas and MX-5s, street-based cars with long pedal travel and maybe rubber or even metal brake lines. Just these kind of situations where there is a longer travel with the actual pucks in the brake pad. Different brake calipers. Different calipers have different characteristics. But yes, I would always recommend doing that just as light as possible to not lose as much speed.
Yeah, and you'll learn over time how much of that left foot tap that you need to get the pad.
Most of the time, it's really like a feather touch, very light, and you can just feel the brakes are there, and you really don't lose much speed, if any at all. So
yeah. I definitely, and pretty much everything that I've driven, have had to at one point or another do a significant amount of left foot braking in a straight line to prevent knockback. And usually just for reference, and if you're not familiar with knockback, obviously the pads are situated in the calipers. As the car goes around the track and goes through high G situations and you're using and not using the brakes, the pads can kind of fall off the surface of the rotor. Yep. So when you go to press the pedal, you have to compress more fluid to press the pads up against the rotor. So then the travel the pedals physically longer, and it can slow down your initial brake application. It feels really weird, and it's super unsettling.
It's unnerving.
Driver.
It depends on it also happens with brake wear too. I've had to do it actually now, even thinking about it, in the GT car, and I still do it in the GT car just out of habit because I want to know that the brakes are there to stop me. But it'll depend on a lot of different things. It's a confidence thing, and it's always a good practice. I'm all for it.
Yeah, and a lot of times I find it's really prevalent in high speed corners, like maybe the S's at Road Atlanta, the uphill S's at VIR, the S's at Watkins Glen, places where those transient high G conditions are knocking those pads off.
Yeah, and curbs are also probably the biggest cause of this, especially like the exit curves of VIR, which you have to use to be fast. They're pretty somewhat aggressive. Or Road America is probably the worst. The exit curbing there, it's like shakes everything to bits. Basically, that shaking is just moving the pads away from the rotor, and that's really all it is.
I think the worst knockback I've experienced from the cars I've driven, the place I've been, is the uphill S's at VIR, because you're both at high speed, high amount of G's, and you're using the curbs, and all those vibrations and forces work together to just
when you go into turn
10 and there's nothing there.
Yeah, it's not a nice feeling for sure.
Not a good feeling. Great questions, guys. I'll wrap up with Richard's question here at the end. Really appreciate you guys joining us. Wish we had more time. It's already been an hour and a half. We usually try to make these 1 hour, so thanks for sticking it out. Everybody's been on here. It has been recording, so I will be posting this to YouTube. You will see an email from me sometime tomorrow. It will be before the end of the day tomorrow, depending on the size of the file and whatever else is going on. I want to make sure I don't commit myself to sending you something first thing in the morning, but you will see an email from me tomorrow with a link to this recording that you can revisit anytime. A couple of you guys had questions, and I sent you in the Q&A to send me those in an email. I believe Eldon, I think Eric, you had a question as well that we just weren't going to have time for, and they were good questions. If you could send those to me in the email, I will we'll send them to Robby, and we'll see if we can get you an answer for those between the two of us. And Richard's question was, is the data available with Apex Pro, or do I need to purchase something else? So the data that we displayed on the iPad, Richard, was from an Apex Pro device in the Apex Pro app. So that was just the Apex Pro app displayed on a iPad Pro. So you do need the Apex Pro hardware to capture that data, and principally because if you download an app that uses your phone's, sensors, it's not going to have enough power to either accurately locate you on the track or even accurately track how much speed you're carrying around the track, let alone G-forces and the other things that it measures. So that is the data output from the Apex Pro app. For those of you that are already in the Apex Pro sphere, Lap Timer Plus, if you haven't seen my email about it already, the price is raising on June 1st because we're adding a whole suite of new features, and it's actually going to become a constant update subscription. So every couple of months, we're going to be adding a custom data channel that we are going to roll out and provide content on how to use it, and that's for subscribers only. And there's also a lot of other perks. Many of you redeemed the discount code I sent for this webinar. We offer even larger discounts on our non-guest webinars, which is just me. Get to see both of our beautiful faces on those. So there's a lot of perks to doing that. So check out Lap Timer Plus. There's a video on YouTube about how to do that. It's purchasable in the Apex Pro app. It gives you predictive lap timing on your phone screen, access to sector times, theoretical time, and various other data channels. If you're using the OBD2 unit, other data channels with that as well. So there's a lot of value to there. Shoot me any questions that you have on that, certainly. Robby, thanks a lot for your time, man. I really appreciate you going through this. I feel like I learned a lot, especially while we were prepping and coming up with notes and thoughts on what we wanted to discuss. Really jogged my brain, and now I have stuff that I want to get out and work on, because I need to work on phase 2 like most of us, because we haven't defined that. That doesn't get talked about a lot in the braking zone, but compressing the whole braking zone a little bit. So thank you very much for being here.
Yeah, no worries. It's been fun. Love to do these things, and it's good to kind of share some knowledge with everyone. So I had a good time, and love to be back for more.
How can people follow you? Obviously, you won Petit Le Mans last year. You guys won at Mosport. You're a full season in the 96 Turner GTD M3 GT6. What do people need to do to follow along with your career?
Yeah, so I mostly use Instagram and Facebook. I would say a little bit of Twitter. So my tags for that is Foley Racing RFR, which is complicated because I didn't have my name. Somebody took it. But you could probably just find me by just Robby Foley on Facebook or Instagram or Twitter. I try to post some stuff there, and hopefully see you guys maybe on iRacing or interact with you on that stuff. And hopefully.
Yeah. Find you in the paddock at an IMSA race, right?
Yeah, totally.
Good deal. And you also gave Lando Norris a hard time on iRacing. I noticed that a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, it was good fun. There's a lot of drivers that have nothing to do at the moment relative to what their normal schedule is. So Lando is a big iRacer, and I've gotten to know him a little bit just playing some other games in iRacing. So yeah, it's been fun trying to compete with the best, I guess. It's been a good challenge. Trying to stay sharp.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks again, folks. And I will get the recording of the session to you, as well as some notes. Send me those questions if we didn't get to them, and we will make sure that we answer them. And stay tuned. We have more webinars and more stuff like this coming up soon. Check out Lap Timer Plus if you want to make sure that you get maximum discounts and value on that stuff. Thanks, everybody, for being here. I'm going to hit the button. It's all going to go away. World's going to be just fine. Stay safe out there, guys. Stay healthy.
Take it easy.